The most secure building in America went dark at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, and the only person who saw it coming was the man emptying trash cans on the fourth floor. Not the ex-military security director with 3 bodyguards, not the cyber team with 14 monitors, not the CEO with $100 million worth of protection wrapped around her like a second skin. A maintenance worker, $40 an hour, steel-toed boots held together with electrical tape. By the time the shooting started, he was already 3 steps ahead of everyone with a gun. This is the story of Ethan Mercer, and nothing about it is what you'd expect. If this kind of story hits different for you, the kind where the person nobody notices turns out to be the only one who matters, then you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next, because we're just getting started. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The elevator button for the 42nd floor had been sticking for 11 days. Ethan Mercer noticed it the first morning it happened, a Tuesday, just after 6 a.m., when the building was still mostly empty and the cleaning crews were finishing up their overnight rotations. He'd pressed the button, felt the slight resistance, the way it didn't click the way it was supposed to, and he'd made a note in the small spiral notebook he kept in the front pocket of his work shirt. Elevator C, 42F button, sluggish. Check mounting bracket and contact pad. That was how Ethan's brain worked. He noticed things. He wrote them down. He fixed them. Nobody at Helix Dynamics particularly cared about any of that. He was maintenance. He was background. That was the guy who showed up before most people arrived and left after most people had already forgotten what floor they worked on. He was 37 years old, medium height, the kind of build that looked unremarkable under a uniform but wasn't. His face had a few years of weather in it. Not dramatically, not in a way that made people stare. Just enough to suggest that he'd spent serious time outdoors before he'd ended up here. In a corporate tower in downtown Chicago, fixing elevator buttons and checking security sensor calibrations on floors nobody visited. His daughter's name was Lily. She was 9. She liked dinosaurs and hated green beans and had recently decided that bedtime was a concept invented by people who didn't understand how important it was to finish whatever book she was currently reading. Ethan's evenings were built around her, dinner at the kitchen table, reading on the couch, negotiating over the green beans, losing the negotiation, pretending he hadn't. He didn't talk about his life before Lily, not at work, not really anywhere. His supervisor, a heavy-set man named Gerald, who smelled perpetually of coffee and wore the same 3 polo shirts in rotation, had asked once early on whether Ethan had done any prior work in security systems before the maintenance job. Ethan had said he'd picked things up over the years. Gerald had accepted that and moved on, because Gerald had 12 guys to manage and no particular curiosity about the backstory of a man who showed up on time, did clean work, and never made trouble. That was the arrangement. That was what Ethan had built, carefully, over the past 2 years. He was fine with it, more than fine. Helix Dynamics occupied the top 18 floors of the Caldwell Tower, a 60-story glass and steel structure that had won 3 architectural awards and cost somewhere north of $800 million to construct. The company itself, defense software, supply chain logistics, AI-assisted infrastructure management, had revenues that most countries would envy. At the top of all of it sat Vivian Sterling. Ethan had seen her maybe a dozen times in 2 years. Not because she was reclusive, she wasn't. She was everywhere in the building's internal communications, on screens in conference rooms, in memos and announcements and the quietly aggressive email chains that filtered down from the executive floor. But because someone like Vivian Sterling and someone like Ethan Mercer didn't occupy the same physical spaces very often. She was 30 years old. People always seemed surprised by that when they found out, as though competence had a minimum age requirement. She'd taken over as CEO at 26 after her predecessor had a stroke during a board meeting, and she'd spent the 4 years since turning what had been a middling defense contractor into something genuinely formidable. The company's stock had tripled. 3 major competitors had approached her about acquisitions. She'd turned all of them down. She was sharp in the way that made other sharp people uncomfortable. She trusted data. She trusted systems. She trusted the security apparatus that surrounded her like a shell. 32 cameras on the executive floors, biometric access on every restricted entry point, a dedicated security team of 18 professionals led by a director named Hargrove, who'd come from a Federal Protective Services background and charged accordingly. What Vivian Sterling did not particularly trust was instinct. or people who claimed to have it. That was, in Ethan's assessment, going to be a problem. He'd started noticing the anomalies about 6 weeks before everything fell apart. The first was small enough that he almost let it go. A motion sensor on the 38th floor parking access corridor that kept registering a negative calibration drift. Sensors did that sometimes. Equipment aged. But this one had been replaced 3 weeks earlier. He'd logged the replacement himself, and new sensors didn't drift. Not this fast. Not this consistently in one direction. He'd pulled the installation record, cross-referenced the equipment serial number, and found that the replacement unit's firmware version didn't match the manufacturer's current release. It was 2 versions behind, old enough that it had a known vulnerability in its tamper detection protocol. Ethan sat with that for a day. Then he started checking the others. Of the 14 motion sensors covering the building's service corridors and maintenance access points, 7 were running outdated firmware. The pattern wasn't random. It traced a specific path: parking access, service elevator, sub-basement mechanical room, emergency blast door controls. Someone had mapped a route through the building's blind spots. He wrote all of it down in his notebook: dates, sensor IDs, firmware versions, locations. He cross-referenced it against the access logs for the maintenance system, which he had clearance to view as part of his job. What he found in those logs made the back of his neck go cold in a way he recognized from a long time ago. There were 17 access events in the past 4 weeks attributed to maintenance credentials, none of which matched any work order in the system. Phantom entries, someone with valid credentials using them at odd hours to move through the building, and the maintenance management system showing the access but not the corresponding job. Ethan flagged it. He wrote it up in a formal maintenance anomaly report. 3 pages, specific, documented, with the firmware serial numbers and access log timestamps attached. He submitted it to Hargrove's security department through the standard interdepartmental channel. 3 days later, he got a response. It was 4 sentences. The gist of it was that maintenance anomaly reports related to security systems should go through Gerald, not directly to the security department. That sensor calibration drift was a normal operational condition, that access log discrepancies were under routine review, and that Ethan should focus on his designated maintenance responsibilities. It was signed by a mid-level security coordinator named Pierce, whose desk Ethan had walked past exactly once, a guy who wore lanyards with too many keycards on them and talked loudly on his phone about fantasy football. Ethan stared at the response for a while. Then he printed it out and put it in his notebook behind his original report. He waited a week. Then he went directly to Gerald. Gerald's office was a closet with a window that looked out onto an HVAC unit. He had a miniature basketball hoop on the back of his door and a photo of his kids on his desk, and the general energy of a man who had found a comfortable level of medium and intended to stay there. "Jer," Ethan said, standing in the doorway. "You got a minute? If it's about the 3rd floor bathroom fixtures again, Martinez is handling it." "It's not about fixtures." Ethan came in and put the notebook on the desk, open to the page where he'd laid out the sensor anomalies. "I've been tracking some irregularities in the security system. I tried to report it to Hargrove's team and got bounced back. I need someone to take this seriously." Gerald looked at the notebook. He looked at Ethan. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "Ethan, talk to me like I don't have an engineering degree, because I don't. 7 sensors on our service corridor network are running firmware that has a documented tamper vulnerability. Someone accessed maintenance zones 17 times in the last month without corresponding work orders. The access path traces directly to the building's emergency systems." He paused. "Someone is mapping this building, and they're using credentials that should have been flagged." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "You took this to security?" "Pierce told me to focus on my designated responsibilities." Something moved through Gerald's expression that might have been discomfort. "Pierce is, look, those guys are protective of their turf. They don't love it when maintenance comes in with systems concerns." "Gerald, someone is running reconnaissance inside this building. You don't know that. The pattern of access events could be a logging glitch." Gerald leaned back in his chair. It creaked loudly. "Look, I'm not dismissing you, but you're a maintenance tech. You're very good at what you do. But security threat analysis, that's Hargrove's domain. That's what they pay those guys for. Those guys aren't looking. Because maybe there's nothing to look at. Gerald said it not unkindly. That almost made it worse. Write it up again. I'll send it through the proper channel with my name on it. That's the best I can do. Ethan picked up his notebook. When did you send it? I'll do it today. He didn't, as far as Ethan could tell. Or if he did, it went the same place the first one had. Oh, he tried one more time. It took him 4 days of calculated positioning, arriving early, staying late, learning the rhythms of the executive floor's administrative staff, before he managed to get himself assigned to a sensor maintenance check on the 41st floor during a window when he knew Vivian Sterling's calendar had a gap. He didn't have a plan for what he was going to say. That wasn't how he operated. He had facts. He had a notebook. He had 2 years of careful civilian life behind him, and a very particular set of pattern recognition skills that he'd spent those same 2 years trying to quiet down. He was recalibrating a ceiling-mounted unit near the main corridor when he heard her voice, precise, unhurried, with that quality of not wasting words, coming from around the corner. The Donovan contract closes Friday. I want the security protocol for the data transfer finalized by Thursday morning. No extensions. She came around the corner with 2 people trailing her, both of them already looking at their phones. She was smaller than she seemed in company communications. Or maybe it was just that she moved like someone who took up more space than her height suggested. Dark blazer, hair pulled back, the focused expression of someone whose mental bandwidth was running at about 80% capacity, just at rest. She glanced at him, the reflexive acknowledgement of a person in the space, and kept walking. "Excuse me," Ethan said. She stopped. The 2 trailing her stopped slightly later like they had a reaction time delay. Vivian turned around. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has given every indication that they are moving and cannot immediately account for why they've stopped. "I'm Ethan Mercer. I'm in facilities maintenance. I need 2 minutes. I have a meeting and I know. I've been trying to report a security concern for 3 weeks through the proper channels, and I keep getting redirected." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform urgency. He just said it, flat and direct. "Someone is running pre-attack surveillance inside this building. The firmware on 7 service corridor sensors has been deliberately degraded. Maintenance credentials are being used to map emergency access routes. I have the documentation." He held up the notebook. 2 minutes. One of the 2 trailing people, a woman with reading glasses pushed up on her head, said, "Ma'am, we really do need to." Vivian was looking at Ethan with an expression that had shifted, very slightly. Not to belief. To something more like evaluation. "You said deliberately degraded," she said, "not just aged out or glitched." "The units were replaced 6 weeks ago, new hardware. The firmware was rolled back to a version with a known vulnerability. That doesn't happen by accident." She studied him for another 3 seconds. It felt longer. "Send it to my executive assistant. I'll have Hargrove review it personally." Hargrove's team already saw a version of this. They told me to focus on my designated responsibilities. Something flickered in her eyes. Not quite irritation. Something more controlled than that. "I'll look at it myself tonight." "The Donovan deal closes Friday," Ethan said. "That's the target window." She absorbed that. "How do you know about the Donovan deal?" "It's on the building event calendar. Reserved conference suites, catering order, expanded security clearance request for the executive floor. Anyone paying attention can see the shape of it." He paused. "I pay attention." Vivian Sterling held his gaze for another moment. Then she nodded, once, short, and walked away. Her assistant scrambled to follow. Ethan stood in the corridor for a while, looking at the ceiling sensor he'd been pretending to recalibrate. He'd done what he could do. He'd gone up every channel he had access to. He'd documented everything. He'd put it in front of the one person who had the authority to act on it. Whether she would, that was out of his hands. He took the elevator down to the 34th floor and went back to work. There was a ventilation panel that needed resealing on the east corridor, and a light fixture in the server room access hallway that had been flickering for 2 days. He wrote both items in his notebook. That evening, he picked up Lily from her after-school program, and she told him with great urgency about a disagreement she'd had with her friend Marcus over whether a T-Rex could beat a Triceratops in a fight, and Ethan listened to every word of it over pasta at the kitchen table and told her, honestly, that he thought it was closer than most people assumed. He tucked her in. He sat in the kitchen after she was asleep and looked at his notebook. Then he did something he hadn't done in 2 years. He went to the locked box in the back of his closet and made sure everything inside it still worked. Because Vivian Sterling was smart, and she might read his report tonight and take it seriously and call Hargrove at 7 a.m. and set something in motion. Or she might have 40 other things demanding her attention and set it aside until Friday morning, and Friday morning might be too late. Vivian Sterling read the report at 11:14 that Thursday night. She knew the exact time because she'd been in the middle of reviewing the final Donovan contract terms when her assistant Renata had forwarded it with a note that said simply, "From the maintenance tech you spoke with on 41, said you asked for it." Vivian had set the contract aside and opened the attached document, and the timestamp on her laptop showed 11:14 when she started and 11:52 when she finished. She read it twice. The second time, she read it slower. The firmware serial numbers were real. She'd pulled up the manufacturer's vulnerability database on her phone and found the exact CVE listing Ethan had referenced, a tamper detection flaw in versions prior to 4.2.1, patched 8 months ago, rated high severity. The 17 phantom access events were documented with timestamps and credential IDs. The geographic pattern of the anomalous entries, when she traced them on the building schematic she pulled from the facilities management portal, formed a line so deliberate it made her stomach tighten. She called Hargrove at 2 minutes past midnight. He answered on the third ring, voice rough with sleep but sharpening fast. That was one thing she'd always respected about him. He came alert quickly. "We need to talk about something," she said. "Tonight." "What level?" "I don't know yet. That's the problem." He was in her office by 12:45. She walked him through the report. He listened without interrupting, which was also something she'd always respected, and then he sat back in the chair across from her desk and was quiet for a moment. "The sensor firmware," he said. "We did a full audit 6 weeks ago. After or before these units were replaced." A pause. "I'd have to check the dates. The replacement request came through maintenance on the 2nd of last month. Your audit was the 28th of the month before. So the units that were replaced, the ones now running vulnerable firmware, weren't in your audit window." Hargrove looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't entirely read. "This came from a maintenance tech," he said. Not dismissively, more like he was placing the fact somewhere. "His name is Ethan Mercer. He tried to bring it to your team 3 weeks ago. Pierce redirected him." "Pierce should have—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I'll talk to Pierce. What I need from you tonight is a decision about tomorrow. The Donovan signing is at 10 a.m., 40 people in the building who wouldn't normally be here. Media on the lobby level, expanded access credentials for 6 visiting executives and their assistants." She held his gaze. "If Mercer is right about the target window, tomorrow is it." Hargrove thought about it. She watched him think. "I can have the sensor firmware updated by 6 a.m., he said. "Lock down the service corridors with manual overrides. Double the team on the executive floors." "And the phantom credential IDs?" "I'll invalidate all of them tonight and reissue through a clean protocol." It wasn't nothing. It was, in fact, a real response, faster and more substantive than she'd expected at midnight on a Thursday. She felt some of the tightness in her chest ease. "Do it," she said, "and get me a list of everyone who has maintenance access to those service corridors. Everyone." "I'll have it to you by 5. He left. She went back to the Donovan terms. She told herself the tightness was gone. It wasn't entirely gone. At 5:58 Friday morning, Ethan arrived at Caldwell Tower and swiped his badge at the employee entrance. The reader beeped green. He took the stairs to the 2nd floor, changed into his work uniform in the maintenance locker room, and pulled his notebook from his bag. He'd lain awake most of the night. Not in a dramatic way. He wasn't pacing or catastrophizing. He'd just lain there in the dark with his brain doing what his brain did when it had identified a problem and hadn't received confirmation that the problem was being handled. Running scenarios. Running counters. Mapping the building in his head the way he'd mapped other structures in other places, at other times in his life, under circumstances that had nothing to do with firmware audits and everything to do with staying alive. He'd gotten up at 4. Made coffee. Stood at the kitchen window and watched the dark outside and thought about Lily sleeping down the hall. She'd be up at 7. Her school had a field trip today. The Natural History Museum, which she'd been talking about for 2 weeks with a specific focus on the new ceratopsian exhibit. He'd packed her lunch the night before. Put a note in it, the way he did every day. Just a few words. "Have a great day." The T-Rex doesn't stand a chance. A callback to the dinner conversation. She was 9. She thought the notes were a little embarrassing, but she kept them. He'd found a small stack of them in her desk drawer once, creased and slightly crumpled, and he hadn't said anything about it. He checked his phone at the locker room. No messages from Hargrove's team, no message from Vivian or her assistant. He didn't know if that meant the report had been acted on or shelved. He tucked the phone away and went to work. The first indication that something was wrong came at 9:17 a.m. Ethan was on the 36th floor, replacing a faulty contact sensor on a fire door, when the building's main security alert system emitted a tone he'd heard only in drills, a low cycling pulse that meant the central monitoring station had received a priority-level conflict signal. He'd been in the building during 2 drills. Both times, a voice had come over the PA within 30 seconds to clarify it was a test. No voice came. He stood still for a moment. The tone cycled twice more, then stopped. The lights didn't change. The ventilation kept running. Somewhere down the corridor, he could hear the distant sound of the Donovan event. Low conversation, the muffled sound of someone's presentation audio from the conference suite. He moved to the nearest wall-mounted security panel, a maintenance-accessible status display that showed system health across each floor zone. The 38th floor sensor cluster was showing yellow, not red. Yellow, which was an advisory status, not an alarm, but the 38th floor was where 3 of the 7 compromised sensors were located. His notebook was in his chest pocket. He didn't need to open it. He took the service stairwell down 2 floors. The 38th floor service corridor was one of the building's structural arteries, a wide, low-ceilinged passage behind the main floor plan that ran parallel to the freight elevator and connected to the sub-basement access shaft. It was not a place most employees ever went. It smelled of concrete and the faint chemical tang of HVAC filtration media. Ethan moved through it quietly. He reached the primary sensor node near the sub-basement access door and crouched to look at it. The indicator light was wrong. It should have been solid green. It was showing a slow amber pulse, the signature of a unit that had lost sync with the central monitoring station. Not a malfunction, a disconnection. Someone had cut the sensor's uplink and done it cleanly enough that the monitoring station was reading it as a degraded signal rather than a deliberate severance. He stood up slowly. The sub-basement access door in front of him was equipped with a heavy-gauge electromagnetic lock, the kind that required both a keycard and a pin, and that logged every entry. He looked at the lock. The indicator light on the lock housing was dark. The electromagnet was off. The door was not locked. Ethan did not open the door. He stepped back from it and stood in the corridor for a moment, running through what he knew. If someone had cut the sensor uplink and disabled the electromagnetic lock on the sub-basement access, they'd done it from inside the building's maintenance control systems, not from outside, from a terminal with valid credentials. The Donovan signing was starting in 40 minutes. He pulled out his phone and called Gerald. Gerald picked up on the 5th ring with the slightly irritated energy of a man who was in the middle of something. "Yeah. I need you to contact Hargrove's team right now. Sub-basement access door on 38 is showing a dead electromagnetic lock and a severed sensor uplink. This is not a maintenance issue. Ethan, Gerald, call Hargrove, now. Tell him the 38th floor sub-basement access point is open and the sensor is down. Tell him I said it's today." A pause. "You're sure?" "Make the call." He hung up and stood in the corridor thinking. If he was wrong, Gerald would call Hargrove. Hargrove would send someone to check. They'd find a dead lock and a sensor that needed service. And Ethan would spend the rest of his Friday explaining himself to a series of increasingly exasperated people. If he was right, and he waited for Hargrove's team to respond through official channels, the response time from Gerald's call to Boots on the 38th floor was probably 8 to 12 minutes minimum. He thought about the building schematic, about the path he'd traced in his notebook, about the fact that the sub-basement mechanical room connected directly to the building's main power distribution panel, its fiber optic trunk lines, and the control terminals for every electromagnetic lock in the structure. If someone went through that door with the right equipment, they could take the whole building dark in under 3 minutes. Ethan made a decision. He made it the way he'd made decisions in another life. Not slowly, not with the comfortable weight of procedure and authorization behind him, but fast, on the information available, accepting the probability of being wrong. He went through the door. The sub-basement mechanical room was large and poorly lit, a cathedral of industrial infrastructure, pipe runs, conduit bundles. the massive housings of the building's primary HVAC and electrical distribution systems. Emergency lighting threw orange-tinted shadows across everything. It smelled of machine oil and old concrete. He heard them before he saw them. Voices, low, professional. Not hiding exactly, more like people who expected to be the only ones there. He counted 3 distinct voices, possibly 4. He moved along the wall behind a row of electrical conduit housings, getting an angle. There were 4 of them, 3 men and a woman. They were dressed in the gray utility uniforms of Helix Dynamics maintenance staff, convincing enough that in a hallway, at a glance, they'd read as background. But the equipment they were carrying wasn't maintenance equipment. It was a pair of compact hard-shell cases that Ethan recognized immediately, because he'd spent years being familiar with what those cases contained. They were working at the main electrical distribution panel. One of them had the cover off and was attaching something to the primary trunk, not cutting wires, not the dramatic thing people imagined. Just attaching a small device carefully, the way someone who knew exactly what they were doing would do it. The whole building. Not just one floor, the whole thing. Ethan had his phone out. He typed a text to Gerald rather than calling. Sub-basement mech room. 4 armed intruders. Building power about to be compromised. Get Hargrove now. He sent it and pocketed the phone and moved back the way he'd come. He had maybe 90 seconds before they finished, if they were good. He needed to be off the floor and moving before the power went. He didn't make it. At 9:41 a.m., the Caldwell Tower went dark. Not gradually. Not with warning. One moment the building was fully operational. Lights, cameras, climate control, the ambient electronic hum of 42 stories of corporate infrastructure. And then it simply wasn't. The emergency lighting kicked in 4 seconds later, bathing everything in that dim reddish-orange non-color, and in the silence that followed the sudden absence of HVAC noise, Ethan could hear, distantly, the sound of panic beginning on the floors above him. He was already moving. He took the service stairwell at a controlled run, not sprinting. Sprinting was how you twisted an ankle on a poorly lit industrial staircase, but fast. Ground rules of a situation like this, things that were so deeply ingrained they didn't require thought, move toward the principal, get between her and the threat, improvise everything else. He didn't have a weapon. He had a multi-tool on his belt, a flashlight he'd clipped on when the power went, and a very clear picture of the building's layout. The executive floors were 40 through 42. The Donovan signing was on 41. He was on 38. He took the stairs 3 at a time. Upstairs, the Donovan signing had become something else entirely. The moment the power failed, the conference suite on 41 had gone from a carefully orchestrated corporate milestone to controlled chaos in about 20 seconds. 40 people, executives, attorneys, support staff, the visiting Donovan delegation, had lurched to their feet, people talking over each other, phones lighting up as people instinctively reached for them, someone knocking over a glass of water that crashed to the floor. Vivian had stood up from her position at the head of the table and said, loudly and clearly, "Stay where you are. This is a power interruption. The building has emergency protocols." She'd meant it. She'd believed it. Then the doors had locked. Not the main conference suite entrance. That had swung open, actually, which meant it was on a fail-safe mechanism that defaulted to unlocked in a power event. It was the secondary access doors, the ones to the service corridor. The ones that, under normal power conditions, were controlled by the security station on the floor below. Under these conditions, something else was controlling them. Hargrove appeared at the main conference entrance, moving fast, with 2 members of his security team behind him. His face had the tightened-down expression of someone managing a situation he didn't yet fully understand. "Miss Sterling, we need to move you." "Where?" "Secure holding position on 40, emergency protocol." The secondary corridor door blew open. Not with explosives, something quieter, a forced mechanism, the door swinging hard on its hinges and banging against the wall. And through it came men in gray uniforms that looked like maintenance uniforms. 4 of them. The first one through carried a compact automatic weapon that he leveled at Hargrove's team before they'd fully processed what was happening. Hargrove's 2 men raised their own weapons. For a moment, the room was a geometry of drawn guns and very still people. "Don't," said the man leading the intruders. His voice was calm and considered. He was somewhere in his 40s, lean, with a face that had the organized stillness of someone who had been in rooms like this many times. Put them down and step back. Nobody gets hurt if this moves right. Hargrove's men looked at Hargrove. Hargrove looked at the 4 weapons pointed at the room. Do it, he said quietly. The guns went down. The room, 38 people who had come to sign a business contract, erupted in a low wave of sound that wasn't quite screaming but was adjacent to it. Vivian stood at the head of the table, very still, watching the intruders move through the room with the systematic efficiency of people who had rehearsed this exact sequence. She was calculating. She was also, somewhere beneath the calculation, genuinely afraid, and the fear was unfamiliar enough that it felt almost physical, like something pressing against the inside of her chest. She'd run scenarios. Helix had crisis protocols. She'd signed off on the security budget personally. She'd reviewed Hargrove's team. She'd believed in the structure she'd built. None of the structure was here right now. The man with the organized, still face moved toward her. Vivian Sterling, he said. Not a question. We're going to have a conversation about the future of your company. The outcome of that conversation is going to depend entirely on how cooperative you choose to be. Who are you? She said. My name isn't important right now. It'll be important in about 4 hours when this is over and I'm talking to federal investigators, she said. She kept her voice flat. So let's just save time. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Almost amusement. You're doing that thing where you project confidence because you think it'll change the dynamic. I'm doing that thing where I ask a direct question because I want information. You want information, he said. Here's some. Every exit from this floor is currently controlled by my team. The security station on 40 is offline. Your building security director just put his weapon on the floor, which tells you everything you need to know about the current balance of power. He took a step toward her. I'd like you to come with me. Vivian didn't move. Behind him, she watched Hargrove, watched his 2 security men, watched the other people in the room, executives, attorneys, assistants, and saw in most of their faces the thing she'd been afraid of seeing, the posture of people who had decided that whatever happened next was someone else's problem. She was alone, not physically alone. Alone in the more fundamental sense of having looked around the room for something solid to put her back against and not finding it. She made a decision, a purely tactical one. I need to use the restroom, she said. The man's almost amusement stayed. I'm not making a move. I'm telling you I need to use the restroom. There's one through that door. She indicated the internal access door at the back of the conference suite, which connected to the executive washrooms and beyond those to the service corridor junction. Unless you'd like to prevent that, in which case this conversation starts off on a specific note. He considered her for a moment. Yeah. Then he nodded to one of his men. Go with her. The man moved to follow. Vivian walked toward the door with the measured pace of someone who had not decided to run, because she hadn't, not yet. And because running with an armed escort in an unfamiliar power-out building wasn't a plan, it was just panic with direction. She pushed through the door into the dim washroom corridor. The escort was 2 steps behind her. She had no idea what she was going to do when she got to the end of this hallway. What she found at the end of this hallway was Ethan Mercer. I was crouched against the wall beside a junction box, doing something to the panel with a multi-tool, and he looked up when she came around the corner. In the reddish emergency light, his face was composed in a way that struck her as almost unreasonable. Not calm exactly, but calibrated. Like someone who had measured the situation and knew exactly where they stood in it. Ms. Sterling, he said quietly, don't stop walking, turn right. She processed this in about a half second, which was fast but felt slow, and turned right. The escort came around the corner 2 seconds later and found Ethan standing in the corridor. What happened next took about 4 seconds and involved the multi-tool and a specific application of leverage that Vivian, watching it from the far end of the junction, could follow the mechanics of but couldn't entirely track in real time. The escort went down hard, not unconscious but thoroughly incapacitated, his weapon skittering across the concrete floor. Ethan picked up the weapon, checked it in a motion so habitual it looked like breathing, and said, "This way." "The conference room," Vivian said. "There are 38 people in there." "I know. Right now I can't help 38 people. Right now I can help you." He looked at her directly. The look wasn't unkind, but it wasn't soft either. "If you're mobile, we move. If you're not, we find a position and hold. Which is it?" She'd built a billion-dollar company on the ability to make decisions under pressure. I'm mobile. Then stay close and don't talk unless I ask you something. They moved. Ethan knew where he was going. He'd known since the moment the power went down, since the moment he'd run up 3 floors in the emergency stairwell. He'd known where the one position was in this building that offered real defensibility. The blast door. It wasn't on any public schematic of the Caldwell Tower. It didn't appear in the general facilities documentation that maintenance staff accessed day to day. Ethan knew about it because 6 weeks into his job, doing a routine inspection of the sub-basement utility runs, he'd found the access shaft behind a false wall panel in the 39th floor maintenance alcove. The door itself was below that, 38th floor, set back in a recess of the mechanical corridor, a 30-ton steel barrier that had been installed during the building's original construction as a Cold War-era contingency, and then apparently forgotten by most people who came afterward. Forgotten, but maintained. The hydraulic mechanism still worked. Ethan had tested it once, quietly, late on a Tuesday when the floor was empty. He'd written it in his notebook. Emergency blast door, 38 sub, operational. Access via maintenance alcove 38C, hydraulic seal intact. Interior space approximately 400 square 50, climate-controlled, independent air filtration. Originally designed for extended occupancy. He'd written it and then moved on to the ventilation panel he'd been assigned. But he'd remembered it. He moved through the dim service corridor with Vivian half a step behind him, and he was listening for footsteps, for radio chatter, for the specific rhythm of people moving with tactical intent and running his count. 4 people in the sub-basement when he'd found them. The group that had taken the conference room had been at least 4 more, plus whoever was running the security station override, which required at least 1 person with technical capability. 10 minimum, probably 12 or 14. Who are they? Vivian said. Low voice, very close behind him. Don't know yet. What do they want? You. Your company. Probably a signature on something. He paused at a corridor junction, listened, moved right. How many people on your board have been pushing for a sale or restructuring in the last year? She was quiet for a beat. That's a specific question. Because this isn't random. Another beat, shorter. 2, possibly 3. Inside job, Ethan said. Someone gave them the building access credentials. Someone knew the sensor layout. Someone knew the timing of the Donovan event. He heard her processing that behind him. The sound of a person reorganizing everything they thought they knew about the people around them. He knew that sound, in a way. He'd heard versions of it before. They reached maintenance alcove 38C. Ethan pushed the access panel open and went through first, clearing the space in 3 seconds. It was empty, a 10 by 12 room of bare concrete and pipe runs, and then pulled Vivian in. The blast door access was behind the second pipe rack. He moved to it, found the manual hydraulic release handle, and pulled. The mechanism engaged with a sound like a held breath releasing, heavy, dense, the groan of 30 tons shifting on precision machine tolerances, and the door began to move. It moved slowly. That was the nature of it. From down the corridor, Ethan heard voices, close, getting closer. Get inside, he said. Vivian looked at the widening gap of the door and at the darkness beyond it. She looked at Ethan. Trust me, he said, and immediately felt the inadequacy of it. She had no particular reason to trust him. They'd had one 30-second conversation in a hallway 2 days ago, and he was a maintenance worker asking her to step into a hole in a wall. She went in anyway. He followed her through. He pulled the interior release. The blast door moved on its return cycle, slower than he'd like, physics being what it was. And from the other side of the corridor, he heard footsteps, close now, and a voice saying something into a radio. The door sealed with a sound that Ethan felt more than heard. A deep, total compression of steel against steel and rubber gasket, and then silence. In the small, independent emergency lighting of the blast shelter interior, Vivian Sterling stood and looked at him. She was breathing harder than she probably wanted to be. Her blazer had a tear at the shoulder from where she'd brushed a pipe fitting in the alcove. Her hair had come half loose from where it had been pinned. She looked, for the first time since he'd seen her in the conference room, like someone who was experiencing something that hadn't been in her calendar. Ethan set the captured weapon down on the floor and looked at her. You okay? He said. She thought about it for a second. No, she said. But I'm here. Good enough, he said. That's the bar right now. He moved to the far wall of the shelter, where a mounted emergency panel, dusty but functional, the indicator light still green on independent power, showed the status of the door seal and the air filtration system. He checked both. Checked the room. Took stock of what they had. One handgun with a partial magazine, his multi-tool, his flashlight, his notebook, his knowledge of the building, and a CEO who, against every reasonable expectation, had followed him through a wall instead of freezing. He turned around. Vivian was looking at him with an expression he recognized from exactly one other context. The look of someone who has just realized that the person in front of them is not who they thought they were. You said you were a maintenance technician, she said. I am. Before that, he held her gaze. Navy, he said. A long time ago. She nodded slowly. Just once, the way she'd nodded in the corridor 2 days ago. Outside the door, 30 tons of steel between them, and whatever was happening in the rest of the building, Ethan could feel faintly the vibration of people moving, looking. He sat down on the floor against the wall and started thinking. The shelter was 412 square feet, which Ethan knew because he'd measured it. Back when he'd first found it, back when the compulsion to know the dimensions of every space he occupied was still something he actively tried to suppress, rather than just accept as part of how his brain was wired, he'd paced it off twice and confirmed it with a tape measure he carried on his belt. 412 square feet of poured concrete, independent electrical, its own filtered air supply drawing from a dedicated exterior intake that bypassed the building's main ventilation trunk. Whoever had designed it to last. Emergency rations in a sealed cabinet on the north wall. Ethan had checked those too, found them expired by 6 years, but noted the water supply was on a recirculating system that was still functional. A chemical toilet behind a partition in the far corner. A wall-mounted communication terminal that connected to an external landline routed through the building's structural conduit, which meant it was separate from the main telecom infrastructure and might still be live. He went to the terminal first. The handset was the old kind, heavy plastic, the cord braided and slightly stiff with age. He lifted it and listened. A dial tone. Faint, but there. He exhaled through his nose and set the handset back in its cradle without dialing. He needed to think before he used it. One call, possibly. The external line would be detectable if anyone on the other side of that door was running a signal sweep, and a signal sweep was exactly what he'd run in their position. Vivian was standing in the middle of the shelter watching him. She'd taken off her blazer, the torn one, and folded it over the back of the room's single chair with an automatic neatness that suggested she did things like that without thinking. She was in a white dress shirt now, sleeves rolled to the elbow, arms crossed. Not hugging herself, just crossed, the posture of someone containing something. That terminal works, she said. Landline, separate from the main building system. He turned around. We use it once, maybe. If we use it and they're sweeping for signals, we've told them exactly where we are. Can they get through the door? Conventionally, no, not without equipment they didn't bring for this. He thought for a moment. They brought this operation to control a building, not to breach a Cold War bunker. The door wasn't in any plan they made. How do you know what was in their plan? Because if they'd known about this door, they'd have secured it before they cut the power. He met her eyes. They're improvising right now, same as us. We're just better positioned. She considered that. You said it was an inside job, someone on my board. Someone with access to the building's operational details. Security sensor layout, maintenance credentials, the timing of the Donovan event. He paused. Who knew all three? Vivian was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, processing. He was starting to recognize the difference in her. The board was briefed on Donovan 2 weeks ago. Full briefing, timeline, security requirements, everything. She pressed her lips together. Hargrove's team sent the security protocol summary to all board members as a standard notification. So every board member had the security layout. In summary form, not the technical detail. Technical detail could come from somewhere else. He thought about the phantom credential accesses. 17 events over 4 weeks. Who has regular contact with your facilities management team? At the board level? She was looking at him with a particular expression now, something that had shifted from the earlier evaluation, Less like she was deciding whether to trust him, more like she was genuinely working the problem alongside him. "Garrison," she said. Her voice had flattened slightly when she said it. "Aldrich Garrison. He chairs the infrastructure subcommittee. He has direct access to facilities reporting. How long has he been pushing for a restructuring?" A pause. 18 months. "He wants a sale to Meridian Defense Group. I've blocked it twice." She looked at the wall for a moment. "He has a minority stake, but he's been working the other members. Quietly." "Not quietly enough," Ethan said. The shelter was very still around them. Outside. Through 30 tons of steel, through concrete walls and pipe runs, and the dim service corridors of the 38th floor, something was happening. Ethan could feel it in the faint vibrations that traveled through the structure, the distant percussion of boots on industrial flooring. They were searching. Systematically, probably, which was what he'd do. He moved to the emergency cabinet and opened it. The rations were useless, but the cabinet also contained a basic emergency kit, a hand-cranked flashlight, a small first aid case, a folded emergency blanket, and bolted to the inside of the cabinet door, a laminated building schematic. Sub-basement and lower floors only, but detailed. He unfolded it and spread it on the floor. "Come look at this," he said. Vivian crouched beside him without the slight hesitation most people would have shown. Another thing he was noting about her, the absence of performative reluctance. She looked at the schematic. "This is the 38th through sub-basement level," he said. "We're here." He pointed to the blast shelter recess. "The main service corridor runs here. This is where I found the 4-person team cutting the power. They came in through the sub-basement access on the parking structure side, which means they had a vehicle on the parking level with equipment." "What kind of equipment?" "The cases I saw were consistent with mobile command hardware. Signals equipment, possibly. Something to run the building control override from outside the main security station." He traced the schematic with his finger. "If I wanted to run this operation, I'd set up my control position here. Sub-basement junction, close to the electrical distribution, line of sight to the service elevator shaft." He tapped the spot. "Which means there's at least one person down there who isn't upstairs managing the conference room situation. A technical operator." Vivian was following his finger on the schematic. "If that operator is taken out of the picture, the building control override loses its back end. Emergency power could potentially be restored to individual floor zones through the manual breaker panels." He looked at her. "But getting from here to the sub-basement junction means going through the service corridor, where they're searching for us." "Yeah." She looked at the schematic for another moment. Then she said, "What's your plan?" "Working on it?" "That's not a plan." "Not yet." He sat back on his heels. "I need to know more about what's happening upstairs. The 38 people in the conference room, are any of them the kind of people who aren't going to just sit and wait?" Vivian thought about it. "Donovan's head of security is named Price. He's ex-military, he'll be thinking. 2 of my attorneys they have concealed carry permits, and they would have come armed today given the event." She paused. "Hargrove put his weapons down, but Hargrove has 14 years of federal protective service. He put them down because he was doing a calculation, not because he stopped thinking." "So upstairs is not completely passive?" "No, but they don't have a picture of the building the way you do." Ethan nodded slowly. He looked at the schematic again. He was thinking about the building the way he'd trained himself not to think about things. In sectors, in vectors, in the geometry of threat and cover and movement. It had taken him 2 years to mostly quiet that way of seeing the world. It came back fast, the way muscle memory always did. Unwelcome, useful, both at once. He pulled out his multi-tool in his notebook. He started sketching a modified version of the schematic from memory, adding details the laminated version didn't have. The false wall panel location, the maintenance alcove positions, the junction boxes he'd serviced over 2 years that he knew better than anyone else in the building. Vivian watched him for a moment. "You've been memorizing this building." "It's my job." "Nobody memorizes it like this." He kept sketching. "Old habit." She let that sit for a moment. Then, "The man who took the conference room? Have you seen him before?" "No, but he moves like someone with a specific background, controlled, economical. He's done this kind of thing." Ethan looked up. He also knew to ask for a weapon surrender before anyone could process a response, which means he's rehearsed managing rooms. That's not mercenary hired help. That's professional. Who would Garrison hire? Who was that professional? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He'd been turning that question over since he'd seen the man's face in the conference room doorway. The still, organized quality of it. The deliberate calm. He'd known people who moved through the world like that. Most of them had been on his side once. Someone who came out of the same pipeline as me, he said. Or close to it. Different door. Outside the blast door, the man with the organized face was not pleased. His name was Damien Voss, and displeasure was something he allowed himself only briefly, as a diagnostic, before moving past it into problem solving. The emotion itself was not useful. The information it contained was. The information it currently contained was the CEO was not in the building where he could locate her, 2 of his men were not responding to radio check-ins, and someone had activated a sub-basement access point that was not on any schematic his client had provided. His client. Aldrich Garrison, who was at this moment in a town car 12 blocks away, waiting for a phone call telling him the situation was resolved, and Vivian Sterling was ready to sign the documents that would begin the transfer of her controlling stake. Garrison had been very confident in the completeness of his building intelligence. He'd provided sensor layouts, credential access, the security protocol document, and a detailed floor plan that his infrastructure subcommittee access had given him over 18 months of careful accumulation. What he had not provided was any indication of a Cold War-era blast shelter on the 38th floor sublevel. Damien stood in the service corridor outside the alcove where his 2 men, one incapacitated, one searching, had tracked the missing CEO. He looked at the wall. He pressed his hand against it and felt very faintly the vibration that indicated machinery on the other side. Hydraulic. Heavy. "There's a door behind this panel," said the man next to him, a technical operator named Chen who had been with Damien for 4 years. "I can see that." "It's not on the schematic." "I know." Chen was quiet for a moment. "Blast rated?" Damien didn't answer. He turned around and pulled out his phone and called Garrison. Garrison answered on the first ring. "Tell me it's done." "It's not done." Damien kept his voice even. "Sterling is contained but not accessible. She found a shelter position we didn't know about. Old construction, not on your documentation." A pause. The quality of Garrison's breathing changed on the other end. "What kind of shelter?" "The kind I can't open quickly without equipment I don't have here." He paused. "Who's with her?" "Her security director, and Hargrove is in the conference room. I'm asking who is with her right now because someone put one of my men on the floor in a maintenance alcove, and it wasn't Vivian Sterling." A longer pause. "There's a maintenance technician. Mercer, I think his name is. He was flagged by my contact in the facilities department as someone who'd been asking questions about the sensor layout." Damien was quiet for a moment. "Mercer. He's nobody. A handyman. He put one of my men down and got the CEO into a blast shelter that wasn't on our intelligence." Damien said it without inflection. "That's not nobody behavior. Can you get through the door?" "Given time. But time is the variable we don't have much of." He was already thinking. "What's the name again?" "Mercer. Ethan Mercer." Damien turned the name over. Something at the edge of his memory was moving, the way things moved when you were reaching for a piece of information that had been filed under a different context. Military rosters were not things he'd maintained access to since his own departure from that world, but names from that world had a way of staying. He'd done a rotation in a joint training environment in Virginia years ago, long enough ago that it felt like it belonged to a different person. There had been a SEAL team running concurrent exercises. One of the evaluators had been someone Damien's own people had quietly noted as someone to watch. Not because he was flashy, because he wasn't, because he was the kind of operative who moved through complex environments and made other people feel like they'd missed something. "Mercer," he said again. Chen looked at him. "Get me everything you can find on an Ethan Mercer. Military background, service record, anything public-facing." He started walking. "And get the charges from the vehicle. We're going to change our approach. The charges are for the structural supports. If we use them, I know what they're for." He kept walking. "Get them." Inside the shelter, Ethan heard it. It was subtle, a change in the vibration pattern coming through the concrete floor. From the irregular percussion of people searching to something more deliberate. Rhythmic. Equipment being moved. He stood up from where he'd been working on the sketch and put his hand flat on the floor and closed his eyes, which Vivian watched him do with an expression she didn't entirely bother to conceal. "What are you doing?" she said. "Listening." He kept his hand on the floor for another few seconds. Then he stood up. They've stopped searching and started moving equipment, something heavy, coming from the direction of the sub-basement. "Can they get through the door with equipment?" "Depends on the equipment." He picked up the handgun from where he'd set it and checked the magazine again. 11 rounds. He'd checked it twice already. Checking it again didn't change the number, but it was something to do with his hands while his brain ran through what he knew. "There's another option." "What option?" "We don't wait for them to come to us." He looked at the schematic on the floor. "There's a secondary access shaft that connects this shelter level to the mechanical room. It's not a corridor, it's a utility chase, about 2 feet wide, runs about 40 feet before it opens into the sub-basement junction." He looked at Vivian. "Small enough that it's essentially one person at a time." She looked at the schematic. "That's where you said the technical operator would be positioned." "Yes." "So you want to go through a 2-foot-wide tunnel directly toward the people looking for us. The person running their building control override is in that junction. If I can get to that position, I can restore power to the floor-level emergency systems, which means cameras come back up, which means the situation upstairs changes. The people holding the conference room are suddenly visible to anyone outside the building who's monitoring." "Law enforcement," she said. "Someone called law enforcement within the first 2 minutes of the power going down. That's a certainty. They're outside this building right now, and they're blind because the cameras are dark. Give them eyes, and this calculates differently." He paused. "But I'd need to leave you here." Vivian looked at him. The shelter felt very small. The emergency lighting was steady, orange-tinted, enough to see clearly. And in it, she looked like someone who had moved through fear into something more practical without fully stopping to acknowledge the transition. "Alone," she said. "Door sealed from the inside. The manual release is that handle." He pointed to it. "Don't use it unless you hear my voice on the other side. Nobody else's." "How will I know it's really you?" It was a good question. He thought for a second. "Tell me something only you know. Something small." She looked at him for a moment. "My assistant Renata's last name is actually Kowalczyk, not Kowalski. She changed it because nobody ever spelled it right. I'm the only person in the company who knows the original. When I come back," Ethan said, "I'll say Kowalczyk." Something moved in her face that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to it. "That's a terrible password." "Nobody's going to guess it." I was already moving toward the far wall, toward the utility chase access, a panel he'd located and confirmed in the first 10 minutes after they'd sealed the door, because that was also how his brain worked. Every room, every exit, every alternative route. Always. "The terminal on that wall. If I'm not back in 40 minutes, use it. Call 911. Tell them blast shelter, 38th floor sublevel, Caldwell Tower. Don't say anything else." 40 minutes. "I'll be faster." She looked at him steadily. "You don't know that." "No," he said. "I don't." He opened the chase access panel. The tunnel beyond was dark and tight, concrete walls close on both sides, and it smelled of the building's deep interior, the cold mineral smell of old concrete and undisturbed air. He clicked on his flashlight, clipped it to his shirt collar so his hands were free, and went in. 40 feet in a 2-foot-wide utility chase took longer than 40 feet usually did. He moved on his elbows, pushing the multi-tool ahead of him, keeping his breath steady and shallow. The concrete was cold against his forearms. The flashlight threw a narrow beam at the darkness ahead. He'd been in tighter spaces. He'd been in them under worse circumstances. He thought about Lily at the Natural History Museum, the ceratopsian exhibit. He'd promised to ask her all about it at dinner. She'd tell him everything in exhaustive, passionate detail, probably starting before she'd even taken her coat off, and he'd listen to every word of it. He focused on that thought the way he'd learned to focus on something specific and concrete when the situation around him was trying to fill his head with noise. Lily talking about dinosaurs. The kitchen table. Her hands moving when she got excited. The chase terminated at a steel grate. He reached it, pressed his eye to it, and looked through. The sub-basement mechanical junction was below and to the left. He was looking down at roughly a 45-degree angle through the grate, which was mounted in the upper section of the junction wall. Below him, the massive pipe runs and conduit bundles of the building's infrastructure. And there, positioned exactly where he'd calculated, A folding table with two hard shell cases open on it, a laptop running on battery power, and a man sitting with his back to the grate, headphones half on, watching three small screens. The technical operator. Alone, as far as Ethan could see. The rest of the team was upstairs or searching the corridors. The grate was secured with two wing nuts. He reached for his multi-tool. The wing nuts came off in 30 seconds. He eased the grate back without letting it scrape. He was 8 feet above the junction floor. The drop was manageable, but it wasn't quiet. Nothing about this next part was going to be quiet. He let himself down by his hands, hung for a moment, and dropped. He hit the floor, and the operator came out of his chair in the same second, headphones flying, wheeling around, hand going toward the side of the table where Ethan could see a holster hanging from one of the case handles. He was fast. Not fast enough. Ethan closed the distance in 2 steps. What followed was brief and physical and not elegant. It never was, regardless of what people imagined. And at the end of it, the operator was on the floor with zip ties from the emergency kit in his pocket, securing his wrist to a pipe, and Ethan was sitting on the floor catching his breath and looking at the laptop. The building control interface was on one of the screens. He could see the power distribution map, every floor zone showing status, the manually isolated trunk lines, the camera network showing dark across all 42 floors. He sat in front of the laptop and looked at the interface. He'd spent 2 years as a maintenance technician in this building. He knew the building management system because knowing the systems you worked in was how you did the job. He navigated to the camera network control, found the floor-level emergency power routing, and started bringing systems back up. Not all at once. Not the main power. He couldn't do that from here without triggering the hard-coded isolation that the operator had put in place. But individual floor emergency systems, cameras, communication terminals, basic lighting on the stairwells. The screens in front of him began populating. 41, 40, 39. The conference suite camera came up and he could see it. The room full of people, the armed men positioned at the doors, the arrangement of the situation. He found the external feed that connected to the building's public-facing security monitoring service, which had a direct line to the city's law enforcement dispatch. He typed into the interface. He sent through what he could, the camera feeds, the floor position data, the number of armed individuals he could identify on screen. The operator on the floor said something that Ethan didn't fully catch. He looked at him. "You have any idea who you just stepped into the middle of?" the operator said. He had the slightly offended tone of someone whose professional competence had been impugned. "Tell me something useful and I won't leave you zip-tied to a pipe in a sub-basement," Ethan said. The operator was quiet. "How many people total in this building who aren't Helix employees?" I already counted 4 down here and at least 4 upstairs. My next question is whether there are more I haven't found, and if you want to be cooperative, now would be the time." The operator pressed his lips together. 12 total. Positions? 4 in the conference zone, 2 on stairwells 40 to 42, 2 in the lobby, 1 on the parking level. He paused. Voss and 1 other are running the corridor search on 38. Voss. That was the name of the man with the organized face. Ethan filed it. What's the exit strategy? When Sterling signs, vehicles in the parking structure. Donovan delegation gets locked in the conference room, timed lock release after 2 hours. Building gets powered back up as we leave. And if she doesn't sign? A pause. Then the conversation goes longer. Ethan stood up. He thought about the equipment the operator had mentioned, the charges that Damien had sent his man to retrieve. He looked at the building distribution panel on the far wall, the one where he'd first seen the team attaching their device. He moved to it and looked at the device still attached to the primary trunk. It was not, as he'd initially registered it, the same type of power interruption hardware he'd expected. Looking at it now, more carefully, with the benefit of not being about 30 seconds away from the building going dark, it was more than that. It was an override controller, yes, but it also had secondary leads running to a separate circuit. He traced the leads. They ran down the wall behind the panel housing into the floor conduit that served the building's structural monitoring system. His hands went still. Structural monitoring, not power, not communications, structural. He pulled out his notebook and turned to the building schematic he'd sketched. He traced the conduit path with his pen. It ran from this panel through the floor and connected to the monitoring network for the building's load-bearing structural supports. The supports in the sub-basement. The ones that, if compromised, would affect the stability of the floors above. His mouth went dry. This had never been just about keeping the building dark long enough for a signature. There was a second element, a contingency. Something to use if Sterling didn't cooperate, or something to use regardless, once the primary objective was complete. The operator said, from the floor, "You found the secondary package." Ethan turned around slowly. He looked at him. "He didn't tell Garrison about it," the operator said. He sounded oddly like he wanted to talk, like maybe he'd been carrying something that was heavier than he'd expected. Voss added it himself. "Garrison thinks this ends with a signature and everyone walks away. Voss has different math." "What math?" The operator looked at the ceiling. Ceiling. No witnesses who can give a coherent account. Building event, structural failure. Everyone in the conference room is... He stopped. Ethan stood in the sub-basement mechanical junction and understood what he was looking at. Damian Voss hadn't been hired to help Garrison take Helix dynamics. He'd been hired to solve a problem cleanly. And the clean solution, in Voss's math, was one where nobody in the building walked out to give testimony. He turned back to the panel. He looked at the secondary device and thought very carefully about what he was and wasn't qualified to do with it, and what the cost of getting it wrong would be. The operator said, "The timer is set to activate when the primary objective is confirmed complete, or manually. Voss has the manual trigger." "How long on the timer once it activates?" A pause. 15 minutes. Ethan put his hand on the device and started looking at it the way he'd looked at things like it before, in places far from here, under circumstances that had felt, at the time, like the worst situations he was ever going to be in. He hadn't known then that the worst situation would find him again in a building he'd been trying to disappear inside of, wearing a gray maintenance uniform with a broken multi-tool in his pocket and 38 people one floor above him who had no idea what was sitting underneath them. He started working. The device was not complicated. That was the first thing Ethan established. Working through it carefully with his multi-tool and the flashlight clipped to his collar, crouched in front of the distribution panel while the building sat dark and heavy around him. It wasn't complicated, but it was precise. Whoever had built it knew what they were doing. The secondary leads were attached to a detonator module that ran on its own sealed battery, independent of everything else, which meant cutting building power hadn't affected it, and restoring building power wouldn't affect it. It would do what it was set to do regardless of what happened to the rest of the electrical infrastructure. The module had a status indicator, currently dark, which meant the activation signal hadn't been sent. Not yet. But the operator had said Voss carried the manual trigger, and Voss was somewhere in this building, and the situation upstairs was not resolved. Ethan worked methodically. He identified the detonator's connection points, 4 leads, color-coded, which was standard for commercial demolition hardware. 2 power leads to the sealed battery, 2 signal leads that ran to the actual charge buried somewhere in the structural conduit. Cutting the power leads would disable the trigger mechanism but leave the charge in place, inert but present. Cutting the signal leads would sever the communication path but leave the trigger live, which meant Voss could potentially bypass it if he got physical access. The correct move was to cut the power leads and physically remove the battery. He'd done this before. Not this exact device, but enough similar ones that the core logic was the same. The risk was that some modules had anti-tamper functions, a secondary trigger that fired if the power leads were interrupted incorrectly. Those were less common in commercial hardware, more common in military grade. This looked commercial. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he made the cut. The indicator stayed dark. No secondary trigger. He pulled the battery housing free, took the battery out, and held it in his hand for a moment before putting it in his pocket. The device was dead. The charges in the structural conduit were still there. He couldn't do anything about those without knowing their exact placement, and he didn't have time to locate them, but they were inert now, disconnected from anything that could fire them. He exhaled once, slowly, let his hands rest on his knees for a moment. "It's dead," the operator said from the floor. "Yeah. Voss is still going to try the manual trigger." "I know." Ethan stood up. "When he does, nothing will happen, and then he's going to know someone got to his device." He looked at the operator. "How long has he been running corridor searches on 38? 20 minutes, maybe more." "He didn't find the blast shelter in 20 minutes, which means he's working outward from where he lost us. He'll get to this level next." Ethan moved to the laptop. The camera feeds were still up, the ones he'd restored. He scanned them quickly. Conference room 41, still the same arrangement, people seated, armed men at the doors, no obvious change. Stairwells. The two men positioned there were visible, not moving. Lobby, two more. Your man on the parking level, is he positioned at the vehicle? Yes. Alone? Yes. Ethan looked at the stairwell camera feeds again. He was running the geometry. Law enforcement was outside. He'd sent the camera data through the external monitoring feed, which gave them eyes. But entry into an active hostage situation with armed individuals required tactical coordination, and that took time. He didn't know how much time had passed since the power went down. Felt like 40 minutes. Could be less. He needed to think about upstairs. Hargrove was in the conference room with 14 years of federal protective service and a weapon on the floor and 37 other people around him. Price from the Donovan delegation was presumably doing the same calculation. There was a version of events where those two men made a move without knowing what was happening in the sub-basement, and that version ended badly if Voss still believed he had a working demolition trigger. Ethan had to get upstairs. He had to get there before Voss used the trigger and found out it was dead, because the moment Voss knew his leverage was gone, the situation in the conference room would change in ways that were harder to predict. He moved to the stairwell access door and opened it. The service stairwell was dark except for the emergency lighting he'd restored, a faint green-tinted glow from the safety strips on each step. He went up fast, keeping to the wall side, listening. He heard them on the 38th floor landing, two sets of footsteps. Not searching, moving with purpose, downward, coming toward him. He pressed into the stairwell alcove below the landing and waited. Two men came through the landing door. Gray uniforms. The first one had a radio in his hand, speaking into it quietly. South stairwell, clear to sublevel, moving to junction. Ethan let them pass, let them get 4 steps below him on the stairs. Then he moved. What happened in the next 12 seconds was not something he could have explained step by step afterward. Not because he didn't know what he'd done, but because the body's memory of that kind of work stored itself differently from ordinary memory. It was stored as sensation and outcome rather than sequence. The weight of the first man, the specific angle required for the second, the sound of both of them going down on the stairwell concrete, not unconscious but controlled, and then the zip ties from his emergency kit, his last two, and the radio, which he picked up off the floor and clipped to his belt. He stood in the stairwell breathing through his nose. 2 more men out of 12. That left, he counted again, Voss plus 1 in the corridor search, 4 in the conference room, 2 on the 40 to 42 stairwells above him, 2 in the lobby. The parking level man was alone and not mobile. The radio on his belt crackled. A voice. Not Voss, someone else. Chen, status. Chen was zip-tied to a pipe in the sub-basement. Ethan said nothing. Chen. A pause. Voss, Chen's not responding. A different voice on the radio. Controlled. Measured. Last position? Sub-basement junction. A pause that lasted long enough to mean something. Go to junction. Find him. Copy. Ethan started moving up the stairs. 1. On the 41st floor, the conference room had been quiet for 11 minutes, in a way that felt entirely different from the quiet of the first 30 minutes. The first quiet had been shock. The sudden compression of 40 people into stillness by the presence of weapons and the complete disappearance of the world they'd expected to be in that morning. The quiet now was something else. It was the quiet of people who had been in their chairs long enough for the adrenaline to settle and the thinking to start. Hargrove was thinking. He'd had his weapon taken. Correction, he'd placed his weapon on the floor, which was a choice he'd made and was not yet sure had been the right one. And he was going to spend a significant amount of time afterward examining that choice if there was an afterward to examine things in. But the weapon was gone, and he was in a chair near the back of the conference room, and he had been, for the past 11 minutes, very quietly conducting an inventory. 4 armed men in the room. 1 at the main entrance, 1 at the secondary door, 2 moving in a loose patrol pattern through the space. The leader, the one who'd taken charge at the door, had left the room approximately 20 minutes ago and hadn't returned. That was interesting. His absence suggested something was occupying him elsewhere, which suggested the situation outside this room was less controlled than they wanted everyone in it to believe. The emergency lighting on the ceiling had changed approximately 10 minutes ago. A slight shift in intensity, subtle enough that most people probably hadn't registered it, but Hargrove had spent enough time in buildings under emergency power to notice. The system had drawn additional load from somewhere. A partial restoration of secondary systems, maybe. Someone was doing something to the building's power distribution. He glanced across the room at Price, Donovan's securities man, a broad-shouldered guy in his late 40s with a flat face and the particular stillness of someone who had done field work, and found Price looking back at him. The look lasted about 2 seconds. No words. Both of them understanding the same thing in the same moment. Something was changing. The question was what to do with that information. Hargrove looked at the 4 armed men. He looked at the room. He thought about Vivian, who was not here, which meant she was either in the building somewhere or she wasn't, and he didn't know which. He thought about Ethan Mercer, who had sent him documentation 3 weeks ago that Hargrove had not, he now admitted to himself with the specific clarity of a man in a very bad situation treated with sufficient seriousness. He thought about what Mercer had said in that report, about the service corridors, about the sensor path. He thought about the fact that the lights had just barely changed. He shifted in his chair very slowly and put his feet flat on the floor. Ethan came through the 40th floor stairwell door and moved immediately left into the maintenance alcove off the landing. He pressed against the wall and looked at the radio in his hand. The channel had been quiet for 4 minutes since the exchange about Chen. That could mean the team had shifted to a different frequency, or it could mean they were managing noise discipline, or it could mean Voss had figured out enough to make radio silence a priority. He needed to know the conference room situation before he moved toward it. He found a wall-mounted maintenance status panel near the alcove, the same type he'd checked on 36 this morning, a lifetime ago, and pulled it open. The camera network feed he'd restored included this floor. He navigated to the status panel's diagnostic screen, which had a basic network port he'd used before for system checks. It took him 90 seconds to pull a still frame from the 41st floor conference camera feed through the diagnostic port onto the panel's small status screen. The image was low resolution and slightly delayed, but it was enough. He could see the room. He could count. 4 men, positions roughly where he'd seen them on the laptop downstairs. The people in chairs, he scanned them quickly, looking for Hargrove. There. Back left quadrant. And Hargrove's posture had changed from the last image he'd seen. He was sitting forward now, feet flat, the posture of someone who had made a decision or was close to one. Ethan looked at the 2 armed men on the stairwell positions above him. One was visible on the status panel's 41 stairwell feed, standing at the top of the stairwell landing, weapons slung, watching the door. His back was partially to the camera. He thought about the radio, about the frequency, about the fact that the conference room team was taking their cues from Voss, and Voss was currently somewhere on 38 or moving toward the sub-basement, and the conference room team was probably expecting a status update that wasn't coming. He keyed the radio. He'd listened to their communication pattern for 20 minutes. He did his best approximation of the second voice he'd heard. Not Voss, the other one. Conference status check. A pause. Then the man at the main conference entrance. Holding. Sterling still not located? Negative. Maintain position. Copy. He reclipped the radio. It wouldn't hold. Someone would query Voss directly within minutes, and Voss would know something was wrong. But it bought him a window. Enough of one. He went up the stairwell. The man at the 41 stairwell landing heard the door and started to turn, and Ethan came through with the specific kind of speed that doesn't allow for a response. The engagement was brief and conclusive, and left the man sitting against the stairwell wall with a multi-tool pressed against the back of his weapon hand in a way that communicated clearly that the next choice he made needed to be stillness. "How many in the room?" Ethan said quietly. The man looked at him. He made the calculation that most people made correctly when it was this obvious. 4. Positions. 2 at the doors, 2 mobile. The people sitting down. Anyone armed? A hesitation. Maybe. The big guy in the back, we didn't fully clear everyone when we came through. It was fast. Hargrove. Or Price. Or both. Ethan made a decision. I'm going through that door. What happens in the next 30 seconds depends on whether you say a word. The man said nothing. Ethan went through the door. The conference room door opened, and for a half second nobody in the room moved because nobody could immediately determine if the person coming through it was one of theirs or not. The gray maintenance uniform registered first, wrong, not quite right, and by the time the man at the main entrance had processed it and started to raise his weapon, Hargrove was already out of his chair. What followed in the conference room was not clean. It was not cinematic in the way that people imagined these things from the outside. It was loud and physical and confused, the way any real confrontation in a room full of 40 frightened people was going to be. Chairs scraping, someone screaming once, Price moving from his position toward the nearest armed man with the blunt efficiency of a big man who has done physical work before, Ethan covering the main entrance while Hargrove dealt with the secondary. 35 seconds, roughly. That was how long it took from the door opening to the moment all four weapons were no longer in the hands of the people who'd been holding them. 35 seconds was a long time when it was happening. At the end of it, Ethan was standing in the middle of a conference room full of people who were shaking or crying or doing the aggressive not crying of people who intended to fall apart later in private, and Hargrove was across from him with a retrieved weapon and a cut on his forehead from something he'd hit during the engagement, and Price was holding the secondary entrance with the weapon he'd taken and looking entirely like a man who was done sitting in a chair. Hargrove looked at Ethan. His expression was not simple. "The power," he said. "Partial restoration. Cameras are up on most floors. I sent feed to the external monitoring service. Law enforcement should have eyes by now. Sterling. Blast shelter on 38 sub-level. She's alone. The door is sealed from inside." He checked his watch. He told her 40 minutes. He was at 32. "She's fine." Hargrove processed this. "You cleared the sub-basement." "Mostly." He paused. "There's something you need to know about this operation." He told him about the secondary device, about the charges and the structural conduit, about what the operator had told him regarding Voss's actual plan. He watched Hargrove's face while he said it, watched the information land and rearrange things. "The device is disabled," Ethan said. "I pulled the battery, but the charges are still in the structural conduit, and Voss still has the manual trigger. He's going to use it, find out it doesn't work, and then he's going to know his position is compromised." He paused. "He's a specific kind of person. When the trigger fails, he won't run. He'll come find the problem." "He'll come find you," Hargrove said. "Yes." Hargrove looked at him for another moment. "What do you need?" "Clear this room. Get these people to the upper stairwells and hold them there. Law enforcement entry will come from below, so up is safer. Keep 2 people who can handle themselves." He looked at Price, who was still holding the door with the steady expression of someone who had made peace with the current situation. "Him, and you. And then?" "Then we go back to 38. Voss found the sub-basement junction at 11 minutes after his corridor search had turned up nothing on 38. He'd known, by that point, that the situation had deteriorated past the margin he'd planned for. Chen was on the floor with his wrists secured to a pipe, conscious and humiliated. The control laptop was still running. The camera feeds Mercer had restored were still broadcasting, which meant the external monitoring service had those images, which meant law enforcement outside had eyes on the inside of the building, and the tactical calculation had shifted. The 2 men he'd sent down the south stairwell weren't responding. He looked at Chen, and Chen told him what had happened, briefly and without embellishment. Voss absorbed it. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the manual trigger, a compact hardened device, toggle switch, and a red safety cover, the kind of thing that had been designed for reliability above everything else, and flipped the cover open. He pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. He pressed it again. The junction was very quiet around him. Voss stood still for a moment. He put the trigger back in his pocket and looked at the control panel where the secondary device had been. He could see the empty battery housing, the cut leads, the clean precision of the work. Not panic. He didn't panic. He took inventory instead, the way he'd trained himself to do in situations that had resolved against him, of which there had been several over the years. The operation was compromised at the technical level. The conference room team was not responding to radio check. The stairwell positions were dark. His extraction vehicle was on the parking level. He had, at a realistic assessment, 2 functional men left, the pair in the lobby. And he had approximately the amount of time it would take law enforcement outside to coordinate a tactical entry, which, given what he knew about how these situations worked, was probably 15 to 20 minutes from the moment they'd gotten camera access. And he had, somewhere in this building, Ethan Mercer. He'd remembered where the name was from. It had come to him while he was running the corridor search, arriving with the specific quality of memories from that period of his life. Clear at the edges, slightly unreal at the center, like looking at something through glass. Virginia. The joint training rotation. He'd watched a SEAL team evaluator run a building exercise so cleanly that Voss's own team leader had mentioned it afterward as a benchmark. Controlled, patient, economical in a way that made other operators look like they were working too hard. He hadn't known the man's name then. He knew it now. He took the stairwell up. Ethan was on 38 when he heard Voss coming. He'd left Hargrove moving the conference room occupants upward and come back down alone, which was a choice Hargrove had objected to briefly and then accepted because Ethan hadn't left space for a longer objection. The blast shelter was his first stop. He went to the door, knocked twice, and said clearly, "Kowalczyk." A pause. Then the sound of the hydraulic release engaging, and the door moved, and Vivian came through it with the expression of someone who had spent 32 minutes alone in a concrete room doing nothing but think and was not in a gentle mood. "What happened?" she said. It wasn't a question. She was already reading his face, his posture, the state of his uniform. "Conference room is clear. Hargrove has the room. Price is with him. 38 people moving to upper stairwells." He paused. There was a secondary device in the structural system. Demolition charges in the conduit. Voss intended to bring the sublevels down with everyone inside. She was still for a moment. "You disabled it." "Batteries in my pocket, but the charges are still in the conduit, and I don't know their exact placement, which means we can't have anyone in the lower floors until an EOD team goes through them." He looked at her. "I need you to go up, not the conference room level, above it, 42. Find an interior room and stay there." "Where are you going?" "Voss is still in the building." She looked at him in the emergency lighting. "And you think he's coming here?" "I think he's the kind of person who doesn't leave with the problem unsolved." He paused. "And I think when he used that trigger and found out it was dead, he started looking for whoever killed it." "You," she said again. "Yeah." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face was working, something that wasn't fear exactly, more like the expression of someone who wants to say something and is deciding whether it's the right moment for it. She decided it wasn't. "Don't get killed," she said instead. "That's the plan." He watched her move toward the stairwell access and go through it, and then he turned back to the corridor and found a position. He chose the maintenance alcove at the junction of the 38th floor service corridor and the sub-basement access stairwell, a recessed doorway that put him in shadow, with a sightline down the main corridor and a secondary sightline to the stairwell door. He had the handgun with 11 rounds, and his multi-tool, and the flashlight, and a very specific advantage. He knew exactly where he was. He waited. Voss came through the stairwell door at the far end of the corridor 4 minutes later. He moved the way Ethan had expected him to. Controlled sweep of the space, weapon up but not extended, reading angles. He was good. Ethan watched him and recognized the quality of the movement the way you recognized a certain kind of accent. Same formation, different country. Voss stopped in the middle of the corridor. He'd registered something, not Ethan's position specifically, just the sense of the space being occupied. That particular sensitivity that developed in people who'd spent enough time in situations where reading empty space accurately was the difference. "Mercer," Voss said. His voice was even, conversational, almost. Ethan stayed where he was. "The trigger's dead," Voss said. "You found the device. That was good work." He hadn't stopped scanning the corridor, but he was talking, which meant he wanted to talk, which was itself information. "I know your background, enough of it. You understand I'm not walking out of this building under arrest." "That part is actually not up to me," Ethan said. Voss tracked the voice instantly. Good ears, no surprise, and moved laterally to put a corridor support column between himself and the alcove. He moved the way water moved around an obstacle, automatically. "You disabled the device," Voss said from behind the column. "That tells me you understand what it means when someone puts demolition charges in a structural system. You've seen it before." "I've seen it before." "Then you understand the people upstairs don't know how close they were." "They know now," Ethan said. "Hargrove knows. Law enforcement outside knows. This building has active camera feeds and your people are either secured or in a room with someone who used to work Federal Protective Service." He kept his voice level. It's done, Voss. A pause. How do you know my name? Your man Chen is talkative when he's zip-tied to a pipe. Something that might have been a sound of acknowledgement came from behind the column. What are you carrying? 11 rounds and a multi-tool. Honest. Seems like the moment for it. Voss moved, not a full break from cover, a partial shift testing Ethan's response. Ethan didn't move. Voss settled back. Garrison is in a car 12 blocks away waiting for a phone call, Voss said. He doesn't know about the secondary device. He hired me to secure a signature, not to... He stopped. Not to kill 38 people, Ethan said. Silence. You added that part yourself, Ethan said. Why? The corridor was very quiet. The emergency lighting hummed faintly above them. Clean exit, Voss said finally. No testimony. No identification. He paused. You'd have done the same calculation in my position. No, Ethan said. I wouldn't. Because you're a better person. Because I'm a father, Ethan said. And there's 38 people in this building who are somebody's something. The silence that followed was longer. Ethan could hear his own pulse. Then Voss came out from behind the column. Not with his weapon up. It was held at his side, at a carry angle that wasn't a threat posture but wasn't a surrender posture either. He was looking at Ethan across 40 feet of dim service corridor, and his face had the quality Ethan had seen when he first appeared at the conference room door. Organized, still. But something in it had shifted very slightly, something that might have been fatigue. You're going to tell me to put it down, Voss said. I'd rather you just did it, Ethan said. Skip the part where I tell you. Voss looked at him for a long moment. He set the weapon on the floor. And then, because that was apparently not the end of it, because men who had spent their professional lives reducing everything to physical problem-solving could not always stop at a gesture when the thing between them was bigger than a weapon, he came forward. What happened in the service corridor of the 38th floor of the Caldwell Tower over the next 4 minutes was the kind of thing that left marks. Not the dramatic choreographed kind. The actual kind. Ethan's ribs on the left side where he'd taken an elbow, he hadn't blocked cleanly, a gash across his palm from the concrete wall when Voss drove him into it, the particular exhaustion of fighting someone who was genuinely your equal and knew it. Voss was better in some ways. He was fresher. Ethan had been moving through this building for 2 hours, up and down stairwells, through a utility chase on his elbows, 2 physical engagements before this one. His body was running on something other than full reserves. But Ethan had something Voss didn't. He wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting because Vivian was on the 42nd floor and Hargrove was on 41 and 38 people who had come to sign a business contract were in the upper stairwells waiting to go home. He was fighting because Lily was at the Natural History Museum right now, probably arguing passionately with her school friends about ceratopsian cranial morphology, and she had absolutely no idea what her father was doing, and he intended to keep it that way by being present at the kitchen table tonight. That was the difference. Not skill, not fitness. The thing underneath. Voss felt it, Ethan thought, felt the point at which the engagement shifted, when the person on the other side of it stopped being someone who could be outmaneuvered and became something more like an immovable fact. He'd felt it himself before. The moment when you understood that the other person simply wasn't going to stop. It ended on the corridor floor, both of them breathing hard, Voss on his back with Ethan's knee across his chest and the multi-tool at his throat. Not a real weapon, a 6-function tool with a bottle opener, but the pressure of it communicated the same thing a real weapon would have. They stayed like that for a moment, both of them breathing. Done? Ethan said. Voss looked at the ceiling. His face was different now, the organizational stillness gone, replaced by something rawer. Older, maybe. The face of someone who had arrived at a wall. Done, he said. From the stairwell above them, Ethan heard the first sounds of law enforcement entry, the specific cadence of a tactical team moving through a structure, the calls of clear echoing floor to floor. They'd come in from the lobby, working upward. They'd reach 38 in a few minutes. He sat back from Voss and let him breathe. He put the multi-tool back in his pocket. His ribs hurt badly enough that he suspected 2 of them were at least cracked, if not worse. His palm was bleeding steadily onto his uniform sleeve. He was sitting on the floor of a service corridor in a building he'd spent 2 years trying to disappear into, and he was tired in a way that went past the body into something deeper. He thought about the kitchen table. He thought about pasta and green beans and a small person who kept her father's notes in a desk drawer. He stayed where he was and waited for the team to reach them. The tactical team reached the 38th floor at 12 minutes past 11. Ethan heard them before he saw them, the disciplined call and response of a unit moving through a structure, the cadence of it familiar in a way that sat somewhere between comfort and old grief. He stayed where he was on the corridor floor, one hand pressed against his left side where the ribs were making themselves loudly known, and waited for them to come around the corner. They came fast and clean, two-man point with weapons up, and pulled up short when they found him, a man in a maintenance uniform sitting against the wall next to another man on his back, both of them looking like they'd recently disagreed about something physical. "Hands," the lead officer said. Ethan raised both of them slowly, which hurt, and said, "Ethan Mercer, facilities maintenance. The man on the floor is Damian Voss. He's the operation leader. He's not secured. I ran out of zip ties." The officers moved in. One covered Voss while the other crouched in front of Ethan with the evaluating look of someone checking for threat indicators. "You armed?" "Handgun on the floor behind me, 11 rounds unfired. I'm not reaching for it." "You're bleeding. Palm hit the wall." He paused. "There are demolition charges in the structural conduit in the sub-basement. I disabled the trigger mechanism, batteries in my left jacket pocket, but the charges themselves are still in place. You need EOD down there before anyone moves through the lower service levels." The officer looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating the category they'd put him in. Then he keyed his radio and relayed exactly what Ethan had told him, word for word, which Ethan appreciated. "There's a woman on 42, Ethan said. "Vivian Sterling, the CEO. She's alone in an interior room. She's not hurt, but she's been in there a while, and she's going to want to know what's happening. We'll get to her." "Get to her first," Ethan said. Not a request exactly. The officer registered the distinction. "Copy that." He keyed the radio again. Voss was being secured 6 feet away. He didn't resist. He lay still with the flat compliance of someone who had made a final accounting and arrived at a number he didn't dispute. Ethan watched him for a moment. The organized stillness was back in his face, but it was different now. Less like a professional attribute and more like something a person retreated to when everything else had been used up. Ethan looked away. The next several hours were the particular administrative chaos that follows a crisis that has been stopped but not yet processed. Law enforcement from 3 separate agencies moved through the building in overlapping waves. EOD arrived within 40 minutes and located the charges in the structural conduit, 4 of them, positioned at load-bearing junction points in the sub-basement that, if detonated, would have compromised the structural integrity of floors 36 through 40. The lead EOD tech came upstairs afterward and found Ethan sitting in the corridor outside the conference room with a paramedic wrapping his hand and told him that the trigger disablement had been technically correct and that the charges were now neutralized and removed. "You done this kind of work before?" the tech asked. "Not in a while," Ethan said. The tech nodded slowly, the way people nodded when they understood that an answer was complete, even if it wasn't full. Aldrich Garrison was arrested at 12:47 in the afternoon in the back seat of his town car 4 blocks from the building, still holding his phone, still waiting for a call that was never going to come. His attorney had been with him in the car, a fact that struck most of the people involved as either very prepared or very incriminating, depending on how you looked at it. The federal charges that followed covered conspiracy, corporate fraud, accessory to armed criminal enterprise, and a list of ancillary items that his legal team would spend the next 2 years trying to reduce. Of the 12 men Voss had brought into the Caldwell Tower, 9 were taken into custody without further incident. 2 were treated for injuries at the scene. The 2 Ethan had left zip-tied in the stairwell had been there long enough that one of them had lost feeling in his hands, which the paramedics dealt with. Voss was transported separately. Before they took him, he and Ethan were briefly in the same space, the corridor outside the conference room, a holding position while the logistics of multiple arrests were sorted out. They were about 8 feet apart. Voss looked at him once. "You have a kid," Voss said. Not a question. Something in the way Ethan had said it in the corridor downstairs had apparently registered. "Yeah." Voss looked at the floor. "How old?" 9. He nodded once, slowly. It was a complicated nod. Not redemptive, not the kind that resolved anything, just a man absorbing information and sitting with what it meant. Ethan didn't try to read more into it than that. Then they took Voss away, and Ethan didn't see him again. Vivian found him at 2:15 in the afternoon. The building had been partially cleared by then, law enforcement still moving through the lower levels, EOD finishing their sweep, but the upper floors had been released for limited occupancy, and most of the people who'd been in the conference room that morning were in the lobby, giving statements or sitting in the cluster of emergency response vehicles outside in various states of post-crisis unwinding. Ethan was on a bench in the 41st floor corridor, the one near the conference suite entrance, waiting for someone from the federal investigative team who'd said they needed a full debrief and would be with him in 20 minutes, which had been 35 minutes ago. His ribs were taped, 2 cracked, 1 bruised. The paramedic had been specific about the distinction, and his hand was properly dressed. He'd been given a bottle of water and a foil emergency blanket that he hadn't opened, and he was sitting with his elbows on his knees looking at the floor. He heard her before he saw her. The same quality of footsteps he'd placed in the hallway outside the 41st floor sensor 2 days ago. Purposeful, not rushed. The sound of someone who had decided where they were going. She sat down on the bench next to him, not across from him, not at the chair the investigators had set up at the makeshift debrief table down the corridor. Next to him, on the bench, close enough that he was aware of the proximity. They sat for a moment without speaking. The corridor around them had the specific quality of a space that had been through something, the emergency lighting still running in places, a coffee cup someone had left on the floor near the conference suite entrance, a woman's shoe that had come off during the evacuation and not been reclaimed. 42 is a long way up, Ethan said. It is, Vivian said. I found a supply closet, spent 22 minutes in the dark with a mop and a box of printer paper. You okay? She thought about it with the same brief honesty she'd shown in the blast shelter. I've been better. I've also been worse, though I'm having trouble remembering when. She paused. You cracked your ribs. 2 of them. The paramedic said you told him you'd had worse. I have. That's a concerning data point about your life. He almost smiled. Almost. It was a different life. She looked at him sidelong. She had her blazer back on. Someone had retrieved it, or she'd gone back for it, the torn shoulder repaired with what looked like medical tape in a fix that was entirely functional and aesthetically indifferent. Her hair was still half loose. She didn't seem to have noticed or to particularly care. Garrison's been arrested, she said. I heard. 18 months, she said. He sat in board meetings with me for 18 months. He pushed the Meridian sale, I pushed back. We had actual arguments about the company's direction. And the whole time, she stopped. She pressed her lips together. Not to contain emotion exactly, more like to contain the specific frustration of a person who prided herself on reading situations accurately and had missed one this comprehensively. I should have seen it. He was careful, Ethan said. You saw it. 3 weeks ago, you saw it. I saw the sensors. I didn't see Garrison. You saw enough to try. She was quiet for a moment. 3 times. You tried 3 times through the proper channels, and every time you got redirected or dismissed or told to focus on your designated responsibilities. She said the last phrase with a flatness that suggested she was quoting something. I was in that group. I read your report at midnight, and I told myself Hargrove would handle it. Hargrove would have handled it if he'd had the time. He didn't have the time because I gave him the report at midnight the night before. She wasn't looking for absolution in how she said it. She was just saying it, the way someone put a fact on the table that they intended to keep looking at until they understood it fully. I've spent 4 years building something I believed in, and I almost lost it because I trusted the architecture of the system more than I trusted the person who was telling me the system had a hole in it. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Down the corridor, a federal agent was speaking into a phone, the words indistinct. People do that, he said. They build something, they believe in it, and believing in it starts to feel like the same thing as knowing its sound. He paused. It's not the same thing. No, she said. It's not. She was looking at the conference suite entrance. The door was propped open, the room inside still in the configuration of the morning, chairs pushed back, a glass of water still on the table. The Donovan contract documents fanned across the surface where they'd been when everything fell apart. The Donovan deal, she said. We're going to have to rebuild the timeline. Probably. They watched their signing ceremony turn into an armed takeover. She almost laughed. A short, dry sound that wasn't quite humor but was adjacent to it. I'm going to send them something very good and very expensive and call Maxwell Donovan personally. He'll sign, Ethan said. What happened today is a story that ends with the CEO's building getting taken over and the CEO surviving it because she made a decision to trust the one person telling the truth. That's not a bad story for a business relationship. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, that evaluating quality again, but warmer than it had been this morning in the corridor, or last Tuesday in the hallway, or at any of the preceding points where she'd looked at him and been deciding something. I want to offer you a position, she said. I figured. Head of security. Real authority, real resources. Full restructuring of the department starting from the hiring philosophy. She paused. Hargrove is stepping back. His choice, not mine. He said something this afternoon about knowing when a system needed new thinking at the top. Ethan looked at the floor. He thought about what it would mean, the title, the office, the kind of visible position that was exactly what he'd spent 2 years carefully not occupying. He thought about what it would do to the life he'd built, the quiet mornings, the kitchen table, Lily's school pickup. No, he said. Vivian looked at him. She didn't seem surprised exactly, but she'd expected him to take longer to get there. You haven't heard the number. The number doesn't change the answer. Then tell me why, so I don't spend the next week assuming the wrong reason. He thought about how to say it. He wasn't practiced at this, at explaining the choices he'd made to someone who had the intelligence to ask good follow-up questions. I left a certain kind of life, he said, because what it was doing to me was starting to affect who I was at home, and at home was the only place that mattered. He paused. I have a daughter. She's 9. She thinks the Triceratops beats the T-Rex in a fair fight, which is incorrect, but I respect the conviction. Something moved in his chest when he said it, the same thing that had been moving through him all afternoon. Every time he'd allowed himself to think about Lily at the Natural History Museum, Lily on the field trip bus home, Lily in the after-school program right now, entirely unaware. A head of security title at a company that just went through what this one went through is not a quiet job. And quiet is what I chose. Vivian absorbed that. She didn't argue it, which was another thing he noticed about her. The absence of the reflexive pushback that most people offered when they heard an answer they didn't want. She sat with it. Then what do you want, she said. To fix the thing that let this happen, he said. Not in a title, in the actual system. He looked at her. Your sensor network needs a full audit and a firmware management protocol that flags version drift automatically. Your maintenance credential system needs a shadow log that cross-references access events against work orders in real time, so phantom entries surface immediately. Your security department needs a reporting channel that doesn't require a maintenance tech to go through 4 layers of hierarchy before someone takes him seriously. He paused. I'll build all 3. I'll document them so whoever runs security after can maintain them. And then I'd like to go back to fixing elevator buttons. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Elevator buttons, she said. The one on 42 has been sticking for 11 days. She made a sound that was the closest thing to an actual laugh he'd heard from her all day. It was brief and a little tired and entirely genuine, and it changed her face in a way that the composed executive version of her face didn't usually allow. All right, she said, build me the system. Name your consulting rate and I'll double it, because I'm not going to win an argument with you about compensation, and I'd rather skip to the part where we agree. She extended her hand. And then you can fix the elevator. He shook it. His hand was the one with the dressing on it, which made the gesture slightly awkward, and neither of them commented on that. He called Lily at 3:47. She picked up on the second ring with the energy of someone who had been waiting, which she absolutely had not been because she had no idea anything had happened, and her afternoon had been entirely occupied with ceratopsians. Dad, okay, so the new exhibit has this animatronic pentaceratops that is literally, it moves its head, it actually moves, and Marcus said it was fake-looking, but it was not fake-looking. It was extremely realistic, and I need you to know that I was completely right about everything. About the pentaceratops specifically, or in general? Both, but specifically the pentaceratops today. A pause. Are you picking me up, or is it Janet today? I'm picking you up. Might be a little late. I'll text Janet to stay with you until I get there. Okay. Another pause, shorter. Are you okay? You sound weird. He was sitting in a federal investigator's temporary office on the 41st floor, which was a conference room that someone had commandeered, and through the window he could see the downtown Chicago skyline and the residue of the morning's emergency response. Vehicles still in the street below, official personnel still moving. He could also see the afternoon light on the buildings across the way. That particular late afternoon gold that Chicago got sometimes in October, when the weather hadn't yet decided to be winter. "I'm fine," he said. "Had a long day." "What happened?" "I'll tell you about it sometime. Some of it." He paused. "How's the T-Rex exhibit?" "Oh, it's the same one as last time. They didn't update it, which I think is a missed opportunity." She was already moving on, which was one of the great gifts of being 9. The capacity to accept the partial answer and find the next interesting thing. "Can we have pasta tonight? I want to tell you everything about the Pentaceratops, but it's a long story and I need dinner table time." "Pasta," he said. "Absolutely." "With the green beans?" "Yes." "Ugh." But it wasn't real protest. She'd eat them. She always did, eventually. He said goodbye and sat for a moment with the phone in his hand and the city outside the window, and the particular feeling of a day that had been a very specific kind of terrible coming to rest around him. Not resolution exactly. The paperwork hadn't been signed. Garrison's lawyers were already making noise. The structural repairs to the sub-basement were going to take weeks, and the insurance conversations were going to take months, and Helix Dynamics was going to be in the news for a while in ways that Vivian Sterling was going to have to navigate carefully. None of that was resolved. It was just moved to the next phase, the way things always were. What was resolved, or as resolved as it was going to get, was this. 38 people who had come to the Caldwell Tower that morning to sign a contract were going home. The building was standing. Lily was at the Natural History Museum with definitive opinions about animatronic dinosaurs, and he was going to pick her up. He thought about something he'd told Lily once, a long time ago, when she'd asked him why he'd left the Navy. She'd been 6, and the question had come out of nowhere over breakfast. Kids did that, lobbed questions at you with no warm-up. And he'd sat there for a moment trying to find a version of the truth that was true enough. He'd said, "I found something I needed to protect more than anything else." She'd thought about that for a moment, the way she always thought about things, with her head slightly tilted and her eyes doing that calculation thing that she'd apparently gotten from him. Then she'd asked if she could have more orange juice. He'd poured it and not said anything else. Some things didn't need the full explanation. They just needed to be true. 3 weeks later, Ethan sat across from Vivian Sterling in her office on the 42nd floor and walked her through the completed security architecture document. It was 41 pages, including the implementation protocols and the maintenance schedules and the credential management system that had a shadow log built directly into the building management software. He'd written it in the evenings after Lily was asleep, at the kitchen table with his notebook and his laptop and a cup of coffee going cold beside him. Vivian read the relevant sections while he watched. She was a fast reader. He'd noticed that about her. She read without moving her lips or reacting to the text, just processing it, and then she'd ask questions that showed she'd caught everything. "This credential audit trigger," she said, pointing to a section. "It flags any access event within a maintenance zone that doesn't have a corresponding work order within a 2-hour window?" "Forward and backward 2 hours," Ethan said. "So if someone generates a work order after the fact to cover an access event, it still flags, because the work order timestamp would be anomalous relative to the access time." "Someone thought of that. Someone tried to exploit that," he said, "which is how I know to close it." She nodded. She kept reading. Outside her office window, Chicago in November was doing what it did. Gray sky, the first real cold of the season settling in. The lake somewhere beyond the buildings with its particular winter mood. The 42nd floor was high enough that you saw the weather differently up here. Less like something happening around you, more like something happening below. "The reporting protocol," Vivian said without looking up. "The direct-to-executive escalation path for security concerns from any department. It bypasses the chain of command for a specific category of flags. High threshold. I defined the flag criteria so it's not a mechanism for anyone to escalate a personal grievance. But if a maintenance tech identifies an anomaly in the security sensor network, the report goes to the security director and to the executive office simultaneously, automatically, with a 48-hour mandatory acknowledgement requirement." She looked up at him. "So the next Ethan Mercer doesn't end up talking to Gerald?" And the next Gerald doesn't have to be the person who decides whether it goes further. She held his gaze for a moment. Something in it was neither purely professional nor the kind of warmth that people usually performed in these situations. It was something more honest than either. The look of a person who had been through something real with someone and was sitting on the other side of it knowing that it had changed the way they saw things. "How are the ribs?" she said. "Better. The left one is still a conversation topic if I turn too fast." "Vivid." She closed the document. "This is exactly what I asked for." "Then we're done," he said. "The elevator on 42, she said. "Still sticking?" "I fixed it the day I came back." He picked up his notebook from the chair arm and stood. It was the contact pad. Took about 12 minutes. She stood as well. Extended her hand across the desk. He shook it. "Ethan," she said. She said it like it was a complete sentence, without anything after it, which he understood to mean something more than the name. The kind of thing you said to someone when the right words for what you actually meant weren't words that existed in the conventional language of professional dealings. He understood it. He didn't have the right words either. "Take care of it," he said, meaning the company, the system, the people in the building, all of it at once. The condensed version of what he would have said if there had been time, and he'd been someone who said things like that in full. She nodded. He took the elevator down. There are things that people assume about the kind of man Ethan Mercer was. That he was defined by his past, by the things he'd done in the years before the maintenance uniform, the missions and the training and the specific violence of a life spent in service of objectives that were never fully explained to the people executing them. That what happened in the Caldwell Tower was a return to who he really was, the soldier breaking through the surface of the civilian life he'd tried to build over it. That's not how Ethan would have described it. The person who fixed elevator buttons and logged anomalous sensor readings in a spiral notebook and lost arguments about green beans with a 9-year-old every evening, that wasn't the disguise. That was the actual man. The skills he'd used in the sub-basement and the service corridors and the 38th floor hallway were tools, nothing more. You didn't stop being a father because you knew how to disassemble a detonator. You didn't stop being a maintenance technician because you'd once been trained to move through buildings with hostile intent. What he'd understood, what had taken him a long time to understand, through a divorce and a custody arrangement and 2 years of deliberately quiet living, was that the skills and the person weren't the same thing. The skills were just what he knew how to do. The person was the choices he made about when and why. He'd chosen to try the formal channels first. 3 times, patiently, correctly. He'd only moved outside them when the formal channels had failed, and the alternative was watching something preventable happen to people who didn't deserve it. That wasn't the soldier taking over. That was just a person doing the thing they could do when they were the one who could do it. The other thing people assumed was that Vivian's offer, the title, the authority, the complete overhaul of the position, would have been the satisfying ending. The recognition, the professional vindication, the man who'd been dismissed as just a maintenance worker, ascending to a position of institutional power. But Ethan wasn't interested in institutions. He'd been inside enough of them to know that they were, ultimately, just the accumulated habits of the people running them, and the habits could be good or bad and could change and could fail, and no title had ever kept a sensor calibrated or a credential secured or a report from getting lost between Gerald's desk and Hargrove's department. What kept those things working was the person who showed up every morning and looked at them carefully. He was good at that. He'd always been good at that. It had just taken him a while to understand that it didn't require a uniform with insignia on it. The Natural History Museum's Ceratopsian exhibit ran through the end of January. Ethan went with Lily on a Saturday in December, on a day when the city had its first real snow and the museum was crowded with families doing the same thing, looking for something warm and interesting to do while the world outside turned white. Lily walked him through the exhibit with the focused authority of someone who had already visited twice and done extensive independent research. She explained the frill variations in the different species, the debate among paleontologists about whether the frills were for display or thermoregulation or both, the specific features of the Pentaceratops that distinguished it from the related genera. Ethan listened to all of it. He asked questions, real ones, not performative parenting questions, and she answered them with the patience of someone who found the questions genuinely worthwhile. They stood in front of the animatronic Pentaceratops for a long time. It moved its head in a slow arc, left, center, right, with a servo sound that was just barely audible over the ambient museum noise. Its eye was amber-colored and glass and caught the track lighting in a way that was, he had to admit, fairly realistic. Marcus was wrong, he said. Lily's expression was the specific satisfaction of vindication. I know. About the realism. He might still be right about the T-Rex. He is not right about the T-Rex. She looked at the Pentaceratops with something close to genuine affection. The horns. That's the thing people forget. The horns are real weapons, not just display. A T-Rex goes for the neck, the frill provides protection, and the horns provide counterattack capability. It's not even close. He thought about it. You might be right, he said. She turned and looked at him with an expression that contained multitudes. Surprise, pleasure, the slight suspicion of a person who's learned that adults sometimes agree with you right before they add a qualifier. I might be, she said carefully. No qualifier, he said. I think you're right. She turned back to the Pentaceratops. He watched her face in the amber light of the exhibit. The concentrated attention she gave to things she cared about, the way she held her head when she was thinking, the specific quality of her stillness when she was absorbed. These were things he'd noticed accumulating over 9 years, the particular inventory of a person you loved watching grow into themselves. He thought about the blast shelter and the corridor, and the moment at the end of a long and terrible morning when he'd sat on the floor next to Damien Voss and waited for the tactical team with his ribs making their complaint and his hand bleeding onto his sleeve and a profound bone-level tiredness in him. He'd thought about this, about a Saturday in December at the Natural History Museum, about the particular way his daughter said his name when she was excited about something. That was why. Not the mission, not the skills or the training or the version of himself that the situation had briefly required. The reason was this: the ordinary weight of someone waiting for you to come home, someone who kept notes in a desk drawer, someone who needed you to be present at the kitchen table. He'd once believed those things were what you protected by going away. He'd learned, the hard way, over years that had cost him things he hadn't gotten back, that the going away was also what you lost them to. The protection and the loss came from the same source. What you could do, what he'd found, slowly, imperfectly, in a maintenance uniform, in a building where nobody particularly noticed him, was stay. Stay and pay attention and do the work that was in front of you. Raise the alarm through the proper channels, even when the proper channels were frustrating and slow. Push when the situation required it, and be still when stillness was what was needed. Be the person in the room who noticed the thing everyone else was too distracted to see. Not a hero, not a title, just a person doing what they could do with the skills they had for the reason that mattered. Lily took his hand. She did it without looking at him, still watching the Pentaceratops make its slow arc. She just reached over and wrapped her fingers around his and held on, the way she'd done since she was small enough to make the gesture feel enormous. He held on back. Outside the museum, Chicago was still snowing. The city moved through it the way cities move through weather, slowly, grummingly, with the low-grade resilience of a place that had been through worse and expected to be through worse again. Inside, in the amber light of the Ceratopsian exhibit, a man who had spent the morning fixing a water pressure issue on the 14th floor of a corporate building stood next to his daughter and watched an animatronic dinosaur move its head and thought about nothing in particular for the first time in a long time. It felt, he thought, like enough. It felt actually